नमस्कार दोस्तों, गुड मॉर्निंग टू ऑल ऑफ यू माय डियर फ्रेंड्स। चलो आज की क्लास की शुरुआत हम करने जा रहे हैं लॉज ऑफ स्टैटिक एंड लॉज ऑफ डायनेमिक फ्रिक्शन के साथ। तो सबसे पहले हम स्टैटिक और डायनेमिक फ्रिक्शन के बारे में जो उसके बारे में हमने पहले पढ़ा था कि अप्लाइड लोड को जो वेरी करते हैं तो स्टैटिक फ्रिक्शन कैसे वेरी करता है और फिर वो मैक्सिमम लिमिटिंग फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन की स्टेज को रीच करता है और उसके बाद वो काइनेटिक्स और डायनेमिक स्टेट ऑफ फ्रिक्शन में बॉडी चली जाती है जैसे जैसे हम अप्लाइड लोड को मैक्सिमम लिमिटिंग फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन से ज़्यादा अप्लाई करते हैं। सो लेट अस स्टार्ट माय डियर फ्रेंड्स। सो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल आई एम टेकिंग दैट डायग्राम फर्स्ट, वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट माय डियर फ्रेंड्स, ट्राई टू अंडरस्टैंड। सो एक डायग्राम प्लॉट करने जा रहा हूँ, वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। तो यहाँ लेंगे अप्लाइड फोर्स, अप्लाइड फोर्स पी माय डियर फ्रेंड। एक्स एक्सिस पे ले लेंगे हम अप्लाइड फोर्स और वाई एक्सिस पे हम लेने जा रहे हैं फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन। वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट माय डियर, फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन। फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन ओके। तो होता क्या है, जैसे जैसे हम अप्लाइड फोर्स की वैल्यू नॉन जीरो से जीरो करते हैं तो स्टैटिक फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन डायरेक्टली प्रोपोर्शनल टू पी उस हिसाब से वेरी करता है माय डियर फ्रेंड्स, ये ध्यान रखना। तो फोर्स ऑफ स्टैटिक फ्रिक्शन is directly proportional to what? Normal reaction. Force of kinetic friction is also directly proportional to normal reaction, my dear friends. And very important, my dear friends, up to limiting friction, force of friction, static force of friction varies directly proportional to what? Applied force, my dear friends. According to applied force, be careful. This is very important condition, my dear friends. Static force of friction. So varies. This is a equation of straight line, my dear friends. This is equation of straight line. Be careful. So that's very important, my dear friends. So here when you take, so you will get a straight line, my dear friends, at 45-degree angle. At 45-degree angle, very important. Angle is also very important, my dear friends. Okay. So what you get? A straight line at 45-degree angle. So here up to this, F static force is directly proportional to what? P, my dear friends. Fs is directly proportional to P. एंड क्या होता है उसके बाद फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन मैक्सिमम बन जाता है, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स। दिस फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन बिकम्स मैक्सिमम वंस इट बिकम्स मैक्सिमम, लेट मी टेक दैट line, okay, and it becomes maximum. Okay, so this is what, my dear friends, this is what maximum force of friction. This is F max, my dear friends, and F max is known as limiting force of friction. Maximum static frictional force This is F max, my dear friends. Be careful. So up to this, then what happens? And at this stage, my dear friends, I am telling you one very important. At this stage, what happens? This equation you can apply at this equation, my dear friends. F static is directly proportional to, or you can write mu coefficient of static friction into Rn. This is very important, my dear friends. At limiting force of friction, maximum friction, static force of friction, you can you apply this. Fs is directly proportional to Rn, and then Fs is equal to mus into Rn. Maximum coefficient of static friction, my dear friends. Mus is maximum coefficient of static friction. Fs is maximum force of friction, very important, and this is also maximum then. Okay, be careful now. So आगे क्या होता है, जैसे जैसे हम अप्लाइड फोर्स अप्लाई करते रहते हैं माय डियर फ्रेंड्स, तो बॉडी किस में आ जाती है, जैसे P रिचेज, P बिकम्स ग्रेटर देन P एक्सीड्स, और P becomes greater than, as P becomes greater than what, my dear friends? Maximum force of static friction, maximum force of static friction, limiting force of friction. Then what happens? Body comes into state of kinetic friction को छोड़ के comes of state of kinetic friction और dynamic friction. Dynamic friction, ये आपको ध्यान रखना my dear friends. And in this case then body, my dear friends, in this case then force of friction does not depend on what, my dear friends? Velocity of body under the action of changing under the action of this applied loading. But very important, velocity should be neither too small nor too large. Very important, my dear friends. Velocity in velocity, when body is having some velocity, that should not be neither too small nor too large. Very important. Moderate velocity, at moderate velocity under the action of applied force, my dear friends. So this force of friction does not depend on what, velocity of body, my dear friends. Be careful. So at moderate velocity, force of friction, force of kinetic friction, my dear friends, force of kinetic friction does not depend on velocity of body. Velocity of body, ये आपको ध्यान रखना माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. ओके, सो ड्रॉ नाउ, वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. सो क्या होगा यहाँ पर, जैसे फोर्स एक्सीड्स करेगा उसके इसमें काइनेटिक फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन होगा, और काइनेटिक फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन इज लेस देन व्हाट, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स? काइनेटिक फोर्स ऑफ काइनेटिक फ्रिक्शन, काइनेटिक इज लेस देन व्हाट, फोर्स ऑफ मैक्सिमम स्टैटिक फ्रिक्शन, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. ये आपको ध्यान रखना है. इवन नोट स्टैटिक भी ले सकते हो, फोर्स ऑफ स्टैटिक फ्रिक्शन, ये आपको ध्यान रखना है. वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. और निकालते कैसे हो एफ काइनेटिक फोर्स को? दिस इज आल्सो इक्वल टू म्यू के इनटू आर एन, ये आपको ध्यान रखना है. एंड दिस वैल्यू रिमेन्स कांस्टेंट एफ के, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. दिस डज नॉट डिपेंड ऑन वेलोसिटी. Okay, or applied loading, my dear friends. Applied loading, so velocity gets changed about by which p varies, then velocity will also varies. Be careful, my dear friends. So but if kinetic force friction does not depend on velocity or either this applied loading, my dear friends, so it remains constant. But very important, now if you take this line straight line, so that means that force of kinetic friction will be equal to what in this zone? In this zone, my dear friends, will be what, equal to maximum force of friction. But that is not, that is wrong, so you need to take down, very important. Okay, so there will be something very important, my dear friends. So here you have to start what, my dear friend? There is a transition here, over there. So what is there? Something like that, my dear friend. There is a transition, so be careful. So this will be like that. Okay, so now here, okay, So now what is this, my dear friend? This is here. There will here will start what happen here, my dear. There this is zone of what? Kinetic friction, my dear friends. Kinetic friction. Here, this zone is kinetic friction. Very important, my dear friends. So some we need to apply loading. Some more loading here, my dear friends. Be careful. Here P, you will take P at maximum, limiting, my dear friends. Limiting P. In case of limiting, let me write it FL, or maximum you can write here limiting. Okay. So here write limiting, and there what, my dear friends? There is a P load here. Pk we can take then kinetic. Okay. So Pk is what, my dear friends? Pk is what? Greater than P limiting. P limiting, my dear friends. Limiting friction. This is also very important. Okay. So then this is kinetic friction, and up to this zone is of what, my dear friends? This zone of what? Static friction, my dear friends. Static friction will prevail. Static force of friction will prevail from this zero loading up to P limit, my dear friends. Be careful. This is static friction, then Pk onward. Very important. You can't take here like straight line here, my dear friends. This then this kinetic friction, because you are wearing load. Okay. So, but at this load, body is on the verge of motion. Body will tend to move, my dear friends, at this P limit. So that is not in state of kinetic. So you need to take some transition there. Then you can take zone of kinetic friction. So this was all about what, my dear friends. And this kinetic friction does not depend on velocity. Very important. This is not function of velocity, my dear friends. This is not function of velocity. Be careful. Or loading, my dear friends. Low velocity or applied load, my dear friends. Applied load. Here now. Here applied load, but when, my? After kinetic force of friction. Be careful. Very important, my dear friends. I have written kinetic, so then you need to know you are taking kinetic. Then it means you have reached, you are applying the load greater than what? P limiting. Okay, my dear friends. So be careful here. So now let us move laws of very important laws of static and dynamic friction. That is very important. So this was basic overview, my dear friends. So be careful. Velocity neither here now. Velocity should be neither too large or too small. Too large or too small, my dear friends. This is very important under the action of applied load, my dear friends, because applied load will change what? If it is coming, velocity is getting changed. Okay, my dear friends. So if you apply more PL load, so velocity becomes, if you are applying very much, so velocity will be very much, because of this. Very important when body is already in motion. Very important. Okay. So now next, very simple, my dear friend. Now I am taking two screen here. Now I am going to use two screens. So one side is laws of static friction, and another side laws of dynamic friction. Okay. So now very important, laws of static friction, laws of static friction. Very important, my dear friends. Okay. And another side is what? Laws of dynamic friction, laws of kinetic friction or dynamic friction. Dynamic friction, my dear friends. Laws of kinetic friction or laws of dynamic friction. Very important. Okay, my dear friends. So let us move to very important, my dear friends, laws of static friction. There are some laws of static friction. So when two bodies, so first law very important, my dear friends. So let me take, okay, when, so let me take it white color, okay. When two bodies, when two bodies are in contact, when two bodies are in contact, my dear friends, so then the direction of frictional force, that is a frictional force, static force of friction, frictional force is opposite what opposite to what, my dear friends, to the direction of motion of body, direction of motion of body. So what happens, body, direction motion body which tends to move, which tends to move. Okay, my dear friends, this is very important first. Then second very important, my dear friends, now very important, my dear friends, when the body is on verge of motion, is on verge of motion, means, my dear friends, body is not moving, body tends to move. Very important, my dear friends. Okay, when the body is on verge of motion, it means body is just very important, my dear friends, body is just one important thing, body is just on verge of motion. Okay, very important, my dear friends. So what will happen then, my dear friends, the force of friction, the force of friction, the force of friction is said to be limiting, is limiting, my dear friends, that is maximum force, that is maximum limiting or maximum force of static friction, my dear friends, static friction. This, so then what will happen, then the ratio, then the ratio of, very important, my dear friends, ratio of limiting this maximum force of friction, limiting force of friction, my dear friends, to the normal reaction, to the normal reaction bears a constant ratio, coefficient of static friction bears a constant ratio, that is, constant ratio means coefficient of static friction in limiting condition, maximum coefficient of friction, my dear friends. Be careful, this is very important, that is what we are studying. F is equal to mu into r, and this implies mu is equal to F divided by r. And what is F max, my dear friends? F max, you can take like that. Okay, very important, this is very important, my dear friends. Okay, so in this case, now next very important, now limiting force of friction, limiting you can say, my dear friends, limiting friction is independent of area, is independent of area of contact, area of contact between bodies, between surfaces, as long as, ये कब तक होगा, as long as the normal reaction remains constant, my dear friends, normal reaction remains कांस्टेंट, जब तक नॉर्मल कांस्टेंट रहेगा नॉर्मल रिएक्शन, तब तक लिमिटिंग फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन एरिया पे डिपेंड नहीं करता। वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। एंड लास्ट, वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, लास्ट माय डियर फ्रेंड्स, so limiting friction, my dear friend, that is maximum force of static friction. Limiting friction. So what is very important, my dear friends, between two bodies, in contact, depends on what? Depends on, this is depends on, my dear friends. Okay, be careful. Depends on nature of contact, nature of surfaces of bodies, whether it is soft, rough or smooth. Rough or smooth, very important, my dear friends. Rough or smooth. Nature means what, my dear friends? Nature means rough or smooth. This means rough or smooth. Rough surfaces or smooth surfaces, my dear friends. Be careful. Now these were laws of static friction. Now laws of dynamic friction. Now four laws here now offer. What? Laws of static friction. Four laws very important, my dear friends, in count. Now laws of dynamic friction. Laws of, okay, I have written that, okay. Laws of dynamic friction. So first laws of dynamic friction. First laws of dynamic friction, very important, my dear, what I have written. Okay, that's important. The magnitude, my dear friends, the magnitude of kinetic friction, the magnitude of kinetic friction, the magnitude of kinetic friction किससे कम होता है, my dear friends? Limiting force of friction से थोड़ा सा कम होता है, is a little less than the magnitude of, limiting friction, maximum force of static friction, my dear friend. Maximum force of static friction, maximum static frictional force, friction, my dear friends, frictional force. वो मैंने डायग्राम पीछे आपको डायग्राम में दिखाया भी है, वहां से थोड़ा नीचे, तब वो कांस्टेंट हो जाता है काइनेटिक फोर्स फ्रिक्शन। जैसे जैसे हम अप्लाइड लोड, लिमिटिंग अप्लाइड लोड से ज्यादा अप्लाई करना शुरू कर देते हैं। सेकंड, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स, वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, सो फ्रिक्शनल फोर्स हेयर, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स, frictional force, kinetic frictional force. Now here bears a constant ratio, same, my dear friends, bears a constant ratio with respect to normal reaction, with respect to normal reaction, my dear friends. That is what here also, what is important here also, my dear friends, like kinetic force of friction is equal to mu into Rn, and mu is mu k, kinetic force of friction, that is mu k is constant here, mu k does not vary, mu k remains constant here, and here also what, my dear friends, constant ratio. So here what is that, this here, my dear friends, so F max is equal to static force, this F static, very important, and this is also remains constant, this is also remains constant, okay, my dear friends, very important, this also remains constant. So now next, third, so there are five laws, one more law is also there. What is that? I will show you, be careful, my dear friends. Now here frictional force is independent of area, frictional, here also frictional force is independent of area of contact between surfaces, my dears. Area of contact between surfaces, bearing surfaces, my dear friends. Be careful. Now, fourth, very important, my dear friends. Now here frictional force, very important, my dear friends. What is additional here? What is additional here? Whether related to this static laws of static friction. What is additional laws here, my dear friends? So frictional force does not vary at moderate velocities. Does not vary at moderate velocities. Moderate velocities, my dear friends. Moderate velocities of sliding, you can write sliding, my dear friends. So what does it mean, my dear friends? That is remains constant. Remains constant. Remains constant. Okay, my dear friends. Remains constant for what? For moderate speeds. For moderate speeds. But very important, but it decreases. But it decreases. What, my dear friends? Very small, slightly. But it decreases slightly at high velocities with the increase in with the increase in speeds, with the increase in speeds, or at high velocities, or at high velocities. That's very important, my dear friends. This is additional here, very important. This is what? This is additional, very important, my dear friends. Be careful. This is other same, something like, but here it is very important, my dear friends. Now, so here this is also, so here it is remains constant. That's okay, you are right. Okay, constant. So now, last, my dear friends, last laws of today class. Now here, what is the formula of frictional force? Frictional force bears a constant SO. Now here, frictional force resistance or frictional resistance. Frictional resistance, my dear friends, is equal to what? F is equal to mu into Rn. Very important, my dear friends. Mu into Rn, force of kinetic friction into normal reaction. Be careful, my dear friends. So what is here mu? Mu ke you can say coefficient of sliding friction or kinetic friction. Coefficient of sliding or rolling friction, my dear friends. Coefficient of what, my dear friends? Coefficient of sliding friction or coefficient of rolling friction, my dear friends. Be careful. Here you can say the body is rolling, so you take here coefficient of rolling friction, coefficient of rolling resistance, as we have studied about it in previous class, my dear friends, in lecture number 19. So this was all about laws of static and dynamic kinetic friction, my dear friends. So now I am going to stop class right now. So thank you very much. We will meet with a new lecture, lecture number 21. That will be about angle of repose. Very important, my dear friends. Coefficient of friction, angle of repose. angle of friction, my dear friends, and cone of friction, effects of friction. Okay, so see you soon. See you meet soon. Thanks to all for giving your valuable time.